Hi, everybody. This is Achilles Justice with the Philosophy Society. It's March 5th, 2024. We are here in the room with some people and some people online. Very good. And for the people of the future, which will be there present, we have gotten to the point with the group where I have done an exhaustive overview of the purpose of the Philosophy Society. And a quick recap, I guess, is so when we say Philosophy Society, a society is some like group of people with some traditions and practices. They have values and beliefs. There's going to be some type of economy, right? And then philosophy, as we discussed, is the love of wisdom, and wisdom has to do with our judgments, the soundness, decisions, actions, experience, and we can even say like reasoning. When we combine these two ideas, we get like, I don't know, a wise, group. And so there's two things. One is content. So you can study like philosophers and things that people talk about. You can study reasoning. But number two is like the structure. And that's how the group is put together. What we're looking at here is there's certain biases in groups, and we want to structure ourselves in such a way as to prevent those biases from being a problem, right? By making them explicit and then practicing skills to reduce the onset of them, this kind of thing. So basically, that's kind of like the very general overview. And going from here, when we talk about content, there are specific things that we can practice to increase the soundness of the structure of the group, right? And so one of those things, we looked at Feeling Good as a book. And the next book is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And so we would say, well, why are you doing this, right? So just throw out some self-criticism here. Like, what's the purpose of looking at this stuff? Feeling Good is really important as we look at the introduction of the book, that about 70% of people that just read the book over a month are almost kind of cured of depression, right? We learn what the causes of depression are, we become aware of it, right? And that would be cognitive distortions. And then we're able to like at least be aware when we're doing it ourselves, and then restructure our thoughts in such a way that they're more realistic and empowering, right? And so you can read this book on your own and try to help yourself out. When we do it as a group, what happens is we can help each other out, right? And both of you guys have done this for me, and that just shows that you're doing very well, right? So
it's the cheapest form of cognitive behavioral therapy, I'd say too.
It's $10.
$10 gets you a long way with that book.
It was free for both of you guys, technically.
That was,
someone gave you this book for free.
Yes.
So the yes. And so that was an important thing to go through. I think it's there is room for like studying the material a bit more, right? Almost like if I gave you guys like an assignment, you know? Yeah, just so that you know it really well and you've done it yourself. So I think that's some form of homework, like for the course to be like you've went through most of the lecture stuff that I've talked about. But to really put it in memory, I think there's room for like a 40-page assignment, for example. Just to say, because if you did that assignment, if you did it, you would really, really, really remember it.
Be engraved.
It would be ingrained in you. Right?
Your form of PTSD will always be there.
Well, let's not say I don't know the PTSD, but
it's 40 pages.
I'm just trying to say that, like, when we look at the main headings of the text, right, and then the distortions, we want to remember all that content, right? And so, how would we do that? It would be some form of writing about that. So, just to throw that at you, if you want to get a credit with the Philosophy Academy, you guys both. That's the last thing you guys have to do, and you can hand it in anytime. But I haven't done it yet. Because the problem with multiple choice questions is you can cheat. Super cheatable to do that. How?
Still gotta know the answer.
Well, I've done a lot of multiple choice questions for open book exams, and you basically just look up the answer.
Oh.
Right? So you may not remember it as well as if you did if you wrote a paragraph about the thing,
Gotcha.
right?
Just saying written responses would be more beneficial.
I think you're gonna learn more. And then so not only would you do that, but then I think it would be good to have it, have your own profile on the website. And then you would upload your assignment to the website. That way you can go back to it.
Other people can see it.
Then you could show people, you could say, hey, look at this. This is what I've done. It's, whatever. So, but that would be after we've graded it and then you've corrected it. I think there's multiple steps for me as the instructor, whoever else was instructing it, to grade it, and then you correct it until it's almost perfect, until you're satisfied with whatever grade you have, right? So that's feeling good. So we've gone through most of feeling good as content, right? And that's for emotional, management. It's to deal with our emotions. And that's important when we go back to, because a group of people is really just individuals together. Right? And so we have to understand the nature of what it means to be a person. And then we add that to groups. And so understanding our emotions is a big deal, right? It's wise for us to have some sense of how to deal with our emotions, and then also our thoughts too. Right? So Burns would say, or some psychologists would say that there's a relationship between emotions and the way we think. That's the whole cognitive distortion thing. But also the way that we behave too. And that's the essence of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, right? But we would almost make cognitive behavioral lifestyle. It doesn't have to just be therapy, therapy is something that you do with a professional, i.e. they have a contract and there's a regulating body. But the Philosophy Society, it's not about it being therapeutic in that conceptual sense. It's about us doing it as a group of people, almost like as a culture, right? Like if you said there's a culture of philosophers and they're the happiest people, you'd be like, okay, I want to become like them, right? In contrast to a cult where it's they're isolated from society and they have to give up all their money to the cult. That's not what we're doing here. That's a different thing. Okay, so we have this here. And now the 7 habits, this is a new thing we're going to look at. We're going to look at the nature of, in some ways, it's a habit of principles. In contrast to principles of habit.
I like that.
Right? So habit of principles is that I'm going to instill in myself a certain way of doing things in my own life, right? And I'm going to have a certain way of doing things with other people. So it has an individual benefit for how I manage myself. For example, the first habit is being proactive, right? That's not really about behavior and the science of learning. It's more just being proactive conceptually makes sense as a lifestyle management principle. And so if I make a habit of being proactive, my life will just be that much more put together, right? So they're principles of how to live, really, just based on what it means to be human or something like that. For example, when we talk about time, and the impact of decisions, right? Those two things together, being proactive is the best.
You said how to be human.
Yeah.
Or how to be a proper human.
How to be your best human. Proper human, there could be some problems with that, but how to be your own best human. And all humans have to deal with time, and all humans make decisions to some degree, right? There could be some people that have a neurological disorder or something of that nature that compromises their capacity for decision making. But in general, the majority of individuals, they're making decisions about the future or in the present, right? Or reflecting on the past. They don't want it to be that way. They're going to change things, right? And so being proactive is almost like saying doing things in advance, not procrastinating, not waiting until the last minute, thinking about what a possible outcome is, and then motioning myself towards success of that outcome as soon as possible. And so just a quick, so like the first habit is be proactive, right? And what he talks about is this nature of stimulus response. I don't even have to look at the book, I know it so well, because I've taught this book several times. And the nature of stimulus response is that we can automatically respond to things, right? Like I just react, okay? But that's not being proactive, that's being reactive. That's how Stephen Covey would communicate that. And being proactive is having separate. So if this is stimulus response, I want to separate the two, right? And in the middle is where I make my decision. And the separation of the two is being aware, is engaging in some form of mindfulness, right? About whatever it is that's going on, or whatever I may be responding to, and then take a minute to make a decision about what it is I'm doing. And that's how he defines being proactive, right? There's a gap of time between stimulus response. And so, yeah, so that's the basis of what he's talking about being proactive. Number
But
two.
you don't have that time.
Then, so remember, it's the habit of these principles. So even though you may have been reactive in the first instance, you can become aware of that reactivity, and then you can instill a proactive approach towards whatever it is that was upsetting you, right? And so that would be engaging in some form of reflection. This was my reactive behavior in the past. I'm going to now think about what I want to do and visualize it, and I'm going to change trajectory towards this. So I'm being proactive in that sense for the next time it happens. And I'm going to keep on practicing that, which means it becomes like a habit. You're happy. That's good. So this is being proactive. This is super valuable, right? Now, he has these 7 habits, and we'll go through them chapter by chapter, right? Now, this whole notion, right? Like all of these different principles that we want to instill into a habit. This is why this book is so good, because there was a lot of thought that went into it. He didn't just write it and publish it. Like he wrote a bunch of stuff down and then reflected on it and tested it out and then went through this mechanism and then published it. So he could have just published these 7 habits, right? But I think that when he was out doing his consulting for businesses and talking to people, he realized that he got some resistance. He's like, no, I don't want to. What are you talking about, Stephen Covey? You think you know what you're talking about? And they got all sassy with him, right? And so before he even discusses these things in the book, he has this introductory chapter called Inside Out. And that's where he talks about the notion of a paradigm shift. Okay? And the paradigm shift comes from Thomas Kuhn, the scientific structure of, the structure of scientific revolutions, sorry. And basically, Kuhn is talking about how science has a certain trajectory based on the researchers of the time. And those researchers or scientists have a certain view of the way they think reality is. And they spend their whole lives with this view. And that's a paradigm, right? It's a way that society views gravity, for example. Like Isaac Newton had a view of gravity.
It's basically a belief system.
It's a belief system, yes. But at like a social level, and it's institutionalized, right? It's not just one person. Stephen Covey kind of drops, so that's Thomas Kuhn, right? Stephen Covey makes it individual. He says you have your own belief systems. And when we shift from our own personal belief systems, when we change our beliefs, that's a paradigm shift, right? And so, again, we'll go into detail once you guys get the book. And again, I invite everybody online and in the future for YouTube viewers to also get the book and look at it as well. So the paradigm shift, the example he gives is somebody that is on the subway, okay? And this parent comes into the subway with these children, and the children are all, it's a father and his kids, and they're all upset. or not upset, but they're like all over the place. They're rambunctious. And it's in the morning or whatever, and everyone's kind of tired and they're reading their newspaper, and the kids are disrupting everybody. And so Stephen Covey's initial response is, oh, you're a bad parent. You're not managing your kids, and therefore you're a bad parent. That's his existing paradigm. And it got to the point where Stephen Covey actually says something to this gentleman. He's like, hey, can you please get your kids to calm down? And the gentleman is, like, he's not even really paying attention, the guy. And then he kind of wakes up and he's like, oh, geez, sorry, I didn't really notice. The kids were probably upset because we just got back from the hospital and their mother died. They're probably pretty upset. And we don't know what to do. And in that moment, Stephen Covey had a paradigm shift. New evidence was brought to the situation, and his perspective on or account for why the children are behaving in such a way immediately changed because of this new information, right? And so this notion of the paradigm shift is something that he is discussing. He spends a lot of time talking about this before he even talks about the habits, right? Because what he's trying to do, this goes under it's a problem of belief. And he's trying to get people to develop the skill of being incredulous, the willingness, or credulity, the willingness to give up your belief. If you're incredulous, you don't give up your belief, or you don't want to see things from a different perspective, right? He doesn't want that.
What'd you call it?
Being credulous.
Credulous.
Right? So he is talking about the paradigm shift so that people can be primed in some way about this belief changing mechanism, that it's okay to change your belief or for whatever reason. Once evidence has been shown to you, or there's some logical argument that shows you that there's a better way. Because he wants you to accept these principles of living, and make them into a habit. But to do that, you are going to have to give up your current way of existing. And so the paradigm shift is an inoculation to resistance. He is already foreseeing, because he's probably tested this out a little bit, that people will be resistant. And so he's like, how can I convince people that these principles are good to do? How do I deal with this? And so his response to that is to discuss paradigm shifts right from the beginning. He's like, just so you know, there's a mechanism for how we change our beliefs. And he references Thomas Kuhn's idea, right? It's not at a full scientific level, it's very individual, which is kind of what you're talking about, right? The paradigm shift is important as a concept throughout the philosophy society kind of trajectory. And the reason is because it goes against things like confirmation bias. Right? That's important because we have a tendency to hold on to beliefs that we already have by only looking at things that show us that they're true, right? And disregarding things that show us that they're false, whatever that might be. So like people that are involved in politics, and this happens a lot, right? People will ignore the fact that Trump committed 91 or has been charged with 91 crimes, and that he's been convicted of a certain amount. He's the first president for this to ever happen, and has been convicted of them, and just focus on how he makes them feel, if he's funny or entertaining, and that emotion is what's more important to these people, right? The paradigm shift is important because this belief changing mechanism is necessary for our growth. If we just hold on to our current beliefs, that is in some ways a learning disability, right? And all humans have a variant of this relative to, whatever biases we want to talk about at that time.
Like being stubborn.
Yeah, that's another way to say it. Incredulous is like being stubborn.
It's called incredulous or credulous?
So incredulous is you're not willing to change your beliefs or see things from a new perspective.
And what is credulous?
Credulous is the opposite.
That you are willing.
Yeah, you're willing to change your beliefs. And what we want to do is we want to proportion our belief to the evidence, right? Or reason. That's the wise way to go about it. And we learn about that in our philosophical endeavors, right? So going back to content. So the first content was feeling good. The second content is the 7 habits. And this is a brief introduction of the 7 habits. And so we're going to go through that. Hopefully we'll start maybe next week. I brought the book today because I believe that you ordered the book. So I was like, okay, I'm ready. We're going to go through that. And then there's 2 ways I can go about it. I can do it like last time where I read the book and meticulously go through it with you guys, or I can just give a brief summary, assuming you've read the book yourself. And the reason that I chose the first option was to make sure that you read it. Why, Achilles? Because a lot of the times nobody would read the stuff before we did class. And so I would just go through it. I would just go through it manually. And it took a long time to get through it. We could do the book in like 2 months if I did a chapter a week, give or take. There's a lot to talk about though. So it's good. There's a lot of learning involved in there. And like what orientation of principles that you have is super valuable. That comes into begin with the end in mind, maybe the second habit. And so, yeah, and so the book is structured into 2 parts, and it's relevant to our growth as human beings, how we begin as a dependent, then we become independent, and then we develop a sense of interdependence. And so he calls it a growth continuum. We want to move ourselves along this continuum to interdependence, where we work as a group together, right? And so 3 of the habits are for independence, right? How to become an independent person, which is be proactive, begin with the end in mind, and put first things first. Begin with the end in mind is about identifying what your values are, what do you want, or what is your goal, and then all of your decisions, we want to be a means to the end of the goal, right? So if I want to, get a PhD, for example, then all of my decisions, we would want to be in line with that, to be the most effective, right? So a lot of this stuff, these principles are conceptual in nature, right? And they make sense. And then therefore we put them into habit. It's not like someone went out and discovered this as a scientific law, and we're doing that, right? Like water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at this altitude. That's a different thing. So it's not empirical in that sense. It's that it makes sense rationally, and it's a priori in some ways. So you could say that that is true without experience, right? That if you have this goal and then all of your moves are in line with the goal, you will reach the success in that goal faster, right? I don't really need to go out and test it. It just conceptually makes sense before I go out and test it, right? So that's what he's saying, make a principle of that, which he says, begin with the end in mind. That's the principle. And then I'm going to do things with principles. Like, so we talk about what is a principle, right? In some ways, a principle is a way for me to guide my decisions and my actions to simplify how to do things, right? When there's ambiguity, when I don't really know what's going on or I'm upset, there's things that are making it difficult for me to know what the best path is. A principle can be the best way, right? Like ethical principles. How do I be a moral or a good person? Well, we've talked about the 7 ethical principles. If you follow these principles, you will be able to uphold your value of being a good person across almost all situations, right? So it's a simplified form of language that directly impacts your relation to the world. Because there can be mathematical principles, right? Or physical principles, E equals mc squared, like some form of an equation. And if I follow this equation, I will yield success more often, right? Almost all the time. And that is an a priori truth. It's something I don't have to really experience to know the truth of, assuming that the way that the principle is structured is sound, right? Which falls back on our reasoning and our concepts and categories we formulated, right?
So no matter what emotion you're feeling, the principles will keep you in the right direction.
Yeah, so for emotions, right, one principle we got from David Burns, his information was, if you're upset, there is an automatic thought tied to the emotion. So if I ask myself, what is the thought that comes to mind relevant to this emotion? And then I look at that, there will most often always be a distortion in that thought. And if you modify, that's like first principle. Second principle, when you find a distortion and you modify that distortion, here are some examples of distortions. He gives us 10, right? So you can kind of go through them one at a time, and you modify that, it will almost always have an immediate emotional relief. And then you replace it with a more realistic thought.
What if it's not from cognitive distortion, it's from like something out of your reality? Like an event or something. That's a different ballgame, right? So it's not coming from your own self-talk. It's not from a cognitive distortion.
Well, okay, so the theory would be that any time we have debilitating emotions, our emotions or our way of being prevents us from having a healthy, happy life, there is a distortion involved. And distortion, the way of thinking, can impact our habits and behavior. Like, for example, there was the story of the accountant who just stayed in bed all day. Right? So there was a thinking pattern about perfectionism, I think, something like that, that prevented them from even trying to do anything at all. Okay? And so there's an impact on the behavior, and the behavior is making them not feel well. So if there's some event that's out of our control, the way I look at the event and how the event impacts my integration with my environment, how I'm behaving in my environment, right? That will reduce my either self-esteem or can make me more irritable. There's different things that it can affect, right? And so whenever something happens, if it's out of your control, then you can't be blamed for its occurrence, right? That would be personalization as a distortion number 10. Personalization is whenever I blame myself for something out of my control, like someone else's behavior or a hurricane occurring in some other place of work. The occurrence of another event or someone else's behavior, right? Like I can, and that's where like, to draw some wisdom, the serenity prayer, right? We can remove the God part and say, Cosmos, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Right? That's very stoic in some ways. And so, or self, I will allow myself to do this. It doesn't have to be God doing it. It's better to be empowered. You know, let God be for the afterlife. We have to focus on ourselves now. And so that serenity part is to say, this is nothing, I can't do anything about this. So there's no reason to be upset about it. I can be calm. And I can focus my efforts on making decisions that I can do something about, right? Does that respond to your event?
Kind of.
Okay.
It's basically not allowing the event to bother you.
It's not that it won't bother
Because
you.
you can't change the event, or you accept what it is.
Yes.
Without giving unnecessary cognitive distortions to it.
Yeah. Like you're gonna have to be mindful. Like remember, like 2 weeks ago or last week, we talked about grief and loss. We talked about acceptance there. Part of the acceptance is having a realistic view of whatever it is that's going on, right? And to not focus on specific data. To like minimize, for example, to exclude other things and make something seem very small, you know, or catastrophize, like exclude everything else and only focus on this one thing, right? Like the acceptance is in some ways, and that's where being mindful is important. Being mindful is to observe how something makes you feel, but not be reactive to that emotion. This is upsetting me. And allow yourself to experience the emotion. You breathe through it. Mm-hmm. And then once you've experienced it, it's like done. Like, okay, I'm done with this now. I know that that's upsetting. And that upsetness will help me learn to not do something in the future if it's something that I can prevent, right? So like if you're in a relationship and the person is mean to you, don't date people like that, right? That's something that you can do. And when you're with this person or someone that's cheated on you, like what are the signs of promiscuity in a person such that I don't end up in a relationship with somebody like that, or I exit sooner, right? And the feeling of hurt from being cheated on, remember that, because it's important to or else you're not going to learn, right? That suffering is valuable to you. Don't get rid of it. It's going to be there for you when you're in a relationship and you notice similar signs, and now you can exit. You're like, well, last time I stayed in this relationship, it got bad. Therefore, I'm going to exit now. Right? And that would be some exercise of wisdom.
The more it happens, I believe then the subconscious starts to notice those patterns. So like when you observe that same pattern in the future with a similar structure, your subconscious, that's what, like when your intuition, I think, will kick and be like, hey, it's kind of like last time.
Yeah, sure.
Without even consciously thinking of a lesson, like, oh, that's what happened, I'm going to avoid it next time. But it happens, and the mind, I believe, on a subconscious level, will learn how to detect the opposite of discrepancies, similarities, and the pattern.
Yeah, social psychology talk about the implicit and explicit learning. So the emotions are really important because, and my justification for why I do that course first is that a lot of suffering in some ways comes from just emotions. And so if I give people the mechanism to modify those emotions, now we can reduce our suffering dramatically. So once we got that out of the way to some degree, right? You guys are aware of this. This is the thing, right? There's been some paradigm shift there. Now the 7 habits is lifestyle principles that are a priori correct, and we can go through them, right? Conceptually, they're true without any experience necessary. And so, so be proactive, begin with the end in mind, put first things first. So put first things first is looking at a schedule. So if these are my goals and values, what do I do with them? I need to implement them in my life. And so what he does is he breaks down that implementation into a weekly process. And he says, everything that's important to you, you need to schedule it in somewhere in your week.
The habit?
Make a habit of scheduling things in. So like the 100 steps, for example.
It's one thing to schedule, it's one thing to do it.
So then there's the habit of, that would be put the first things first, is doing the things on the schedule. Now that habit has been difficult for me because I'm not very structured. I kind of go by feel, and I do things like I'll do things in order, but I also will put things in that I feel. So instead of being tied to a schedule, I have like a list of things to do of priority. And sometimes I'll hold on the list because I need to like relax a little bit. Right? And then I'll go back to the list after. So if like, for example, on the schedule, it says at 2 p.m., do the 100 steps, the entrepreneurship course, right? But I just dealt with some house management stuff and I feel very stressed, right? It may not be the best to do it then. It may be better for me and my well-being to take like a 15-minute break or lie down for an hour. And then at 3, I'll do wherever I feel better, I'll continue with that next activity. Right? So that's one small criticism I have of that and the way that I've modified it to make it work for me a bit better. Stephen Covey would say that, don't let the way you feel determine your decisions because you're being reactive to your emotions. But at the same time, I think it's important for us to be in tune with our feelings and guide ourselves towards like well-being. Then he talks about thinking win-win. So thinking win-win, no, maybe the other one is seek first to understand and then be understood. So this habit, now we're in the interdependence section, is to be empathetic, right? So it's very close to Burns's disarming technique. Agree in principle, be empathetic, and then negotiate, right? And so being empathetic or seek first to understand is before you even say anything, you want to listen to what the other person has to say. Understand how they see things, understand what their paradigm is, and then you can communicate from their perspective, right? Which is very effective in some ways. Because if I just speak from my perspective, they may not understand me, and because they have their own worldview, and I might not get anywhere in the communication.
Especially if they don't care.
Yeah, we have to, if I listen to their perspective, I can see what they care about. And then I can speak including those properties, right? Sometimes if you hear somebody out, then they will reciprocate in kind and hear you out and hear what you have to say, right? The next habit would be think win-win. So in interactions, we always, like he would say, the principle of always looking for a mutual benefit is best. If it's a win-lose or a lose-lose situation, then it's okay to disengage from that engagement, whatever it might be, right? And then the final one is synergize, which basically means let's work together as a group and brainstorm collectively, because two heads are better than one, is kind of the perspective on that. Now, Ayn Rand kind of disagrees that being creative means that you have like an independent, authority over your creativity, and that we can get like a hodgepodge or a compromised outcome that is not as good as if somebody focused and did what they wanted to do. So there is kind of I think there is a place for both, right? Not all opinions are valid, but the contribution of others towards the same goal, I think we have to define what the goal is, which will go back to step 2 or habit 2, begin with the end in mind. And so some people may not A, know what their goals or values are, and B, if there are conflicting values, then we may not achieve the best outcome for one value because our efforts are being spread amongst two of them. And that may be Ayn Rand's main criticism there. And the last habit is sharpen the saw, or renewal, which means that you just go back to the beginning and you do it all over again. Right? Which again is one of those things that he, I would say, added conceptually later after doing it, that he realized that he had to continually go through this process. Right? So that's the book. I can even go to BMV myself, and then you guys can just pay me back or something like that. I'm kind of broke at the moment, but I know that you are in a different place, you're in a different city, and you, let's go with you. Easier to
Organize something.
Yeah. And just so that you guys have it, right? And yeah, and then we can go through it. So that's these two like courses are important. Number 3 generally is something called the relaxation response. And this is a book that Burns recommends in the first edition of Feeling Good at the end of the book. That's how I found the book. And it was written in the 80s as well, or no, late 70s. And Herbert Benson was a cardiologist, like a heart doctor. And he asked, is there a diametrically opposed mechanism in the body that is in contrast to stress? Like when we get stressed out and upset, our arteries close up and lead to like heart attacks and strokes. And so the relaxation response is what he found out was the case. And there's 4 properties of engaging the relaxation response. And so it's just a form of meditation, basically, or a relaxation breathing technique. And so that's super important, again, for our well-being as like a skill to develop. So that's the next one. It's a shorter book. That would be the next thing we go to. And I think mindfulness is something else to look at. Right? And once we get to like this stage, in our toolkit, we're doing pretty good, right? We have the tools to be able to manage life on our own, and as a group, we'll be more successful. And then basically, like, again, we can go through specific things in the history of philosophy. I think that's important. But these things are more important because they have to do with well-being, right? All of this stuff. And my specific trajectory of philosophy is the well-being / eudaimonia, like living a good life. And these are the skills to achieve that outcome. So that's why I focus on this stuff, because it's wise to do that. And yeah, and that's where it becomes like practical philosophy, like things you can do. And some people will criticize this as like self-help in some ways. Self-help does have a lot of pseudoscience in it, and we can be very ineffective in how we engage with ourselves. But I think that looking at conceptual things that make sense, like the Stephen Covey stuff, or things that are empirically valid, like feeling good and the relaxation response, those, are not pseudoscientific. And therefore, instead of saying self-help, I just say practical philosophy.
What's the difference then? Like, what is something that's pseudo, how'd you say it?
Science.
Pseudoscience?
Pseudoscience is something that
I know what it is, but I'm saying like an example of where you've noticed that.
Reiki therapy.
Oh.
Like this notion that you're healing people with an energy,
Hmm.
right? Aside from the placebo effect, there's no evidence to show that it has any effect on someone, right? Or like homeopathy is a pseudoscience, right? Because it's appearing to be scientific, but science has, and we said that our principles of the scientific method, right? Like simplicity, falsification, or testing, our ability to predict things, right? Occam's razor, which is simplicity. So, or no, that's different. It's just not making assumptions. Being parsimonious. So those theories don't follow a scientific practice, right? They're almost like little mini religions, just without a God. They're belief systems that people have faith in, meaning that there's no real reason to believe it aside from their own personal experience. But there's biases in that, right? And so being scientific is in some ways being humble that maybe it's true or maybe it's not true, right? And I'm going to find out. I'm going to find some tool or device that kind of like tests it, just in case it's something else, right? Like the correlation causation fallacy. Just because something's correlated doesn't mean it's caused, and so, yeah, I guess I can like write that down. So in contrast, we have pseudoscience. So homeopathy is the belief that like, if you take a substance and you dilute that substance, there's this molecular memory property where the substance gets copied to the other substances in the water. There's some, and this is the pseudoscience part, that there's no evidence that's the case. Another one is chiropractics, like a chiropractor.
Actually, there's one scientist that did that. With the frozen water.
Okay.
Where like emotions, which is like energy motion, the way you would talk to the water, which is weird, it would have a different molecular structure after frozen and look like while observing under the microscope.
Mm-hmm.
When the rice.
Yeah, there's like a movie like in the 2000s called What the Bleep Do We Know? And they kind of talked about that.
So that's similar?
Yeah, I think that the emotion water thing. And the argument would be if it has this effect on a droplet of water and your body is made of 70% water, think of what the effect has on you.
I think it was a cup. Not mistaken.
Yeah.
We're mostly made of water. Like you can feel it sometimes too, like and say fuck you, you're an asshole.
Mm-hmm.
Like it'll affect not only your mind, it affects your whole body, I guess, because it's all connected on the nervous system. It's like water throughout it. I don't know, it's a very weird concept.
I think hormones might account for that better,
Mhm.
right? Or the way that your brain is wired and the neurons that are being activated when you're upset and your limbic system, you know? I think there's other chemicals than the orientation of water that will have more explanatory power than that one. Because it's true, right?
Mhm.
If you had like, if there's angry water and happy water, if I just drank the happy water, I'd be happy. But if I drank someone that made angry water, then I'd be poisoned by the water and get angry. But that doesn't actually happen.
Hmm.
Right?
I guess. I mean, I'm no scientist.
I'm just saying, like, if the water now has the anger, if the emotion is in the water now, then anybody that drinks that emotion would be upset. But like, think of all the bottled water companies that exist in the world. Not all of the staff that are making that water are in a good mood. Many of them are probably upset because they have a shitty job at a factory, right? So that would mean that most bottled water is going to have the same emotions as the people that are touching it or in contact with it. So all the people drinking that water would then have those negative emotions too. And that's not really the case. Usually people that drink bottled water are happy because they're thirsty. Right?
I guess, yeah.
So what we want to do is we want to identify pseudoscientific practices, and we're going to utilize those properties of the principles of scientific thinking, right? And we're going to apply them to these ideas. And so these ideas over here are not pseudoscientific. Like in Feeling Good, at the very beginning of the book, there was that study that talked about how an external set of researchers looked at a control group and the experimental group, some group that waited a month and they measured their self-esteem, and a group that did it immediately, and the ones that started immediately had benefits, whereas the ones that waited a month, their benefits didn't occur until they started the experimental, like the treatment, which would be reading the book. Yeah, so there's evidence to indicate that CBT is very effective. And the 7 Habits is different in the sense that it's not empirical. So we have to observe this. We can test it out, right? You can still empirically test this, like have people that are not proactive, that are just reactive, and see what their well-being is. That would be like a control group. The experimental group would be have people that follow a proactive principle and see what their well-being is. But in itself, this is some ways a priori, and it does make sense. So we're going to evaluate that based on the reasoning alone. But we can also test it too. And then, so it does, so for the falsification scientific principle, things like, homeopathy, or I guess not, any kind of a theory that can't be tested, right? So for example, this is a better example. When a person comes in and they say they can talk to the dead, like medium, psychic medium, right? So a psychic medium goes in there and they're like, I've talked to Nostradamus and he says that there's going to be a great flood. You're like, okay, when's the flood going to be? And he's like, blah, blah, blah. Or I can talk to whoever, right? And like, okay, well, you have some questions for Einstein. So why don't you come in and you can help us figure out these physics problems. Or I'd like to talk with Plato about his lost books, or anybody else that's died that is important to us. Like, yeah, I'm not going to say that joke. I'm going to give a joke about Trump and Hitler, but I should not. And so, like, who would Trump want to talk to? Ooh. And so, if it is true what the medium says, that they can talk to dead people, well, there's a whole bunch of people that have died that we would like to speak to, right? Just to see what happened. And that would also, if mediums were real, all murders, a lot of murders there would be no case, because the medium would be like, and it was this person, and then they're like, oh, look, it was them, the body's in their room. It would, like, you would just very quickly, yes.
I have a weird thing from the CIA.
Okay.
Where they would use people with psychic abilities in the 70s, I believe, or 80s. It's all in the vault, the CIA documents. Well, how believable is that? It's from the CIA that they're using people with psychic abilities to help locate political refugees or journalists or something. I'll pull it up.
It's, yeah. Okay, we can put that on the chart. That's fine. So, yeah. So if it was true, right? If being a psychic was a real thing, that gambling would not be an industry that made any money, right? Because gambling is based on statistics, and they structure games to make sure that the house wins because it's business. And if psychics exist, then the business would fail. It would never exist ever, right? And so what happens though sometimes is the psychic, they say, come into our office, we're going to test out your abilities. And the psychic says, oh, no. Whenever I'm being tested, my powers are reduced or eliminated. And so what that person is saying is I'm impervious to falsification. You can't actually test me. And so that makes it unscientific, right? So yeah, pseudoscience. And so we want to apply our scientific principles to our reasoning and our practices. And that goes back to our well-being. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that they said in the Cold War to kind of like make the Russians uncomfortable that they had these superpowers and stuff like that. But I don't know how real or true it really is.
Just a whole bunch of series stuff like that.
A lot of what?
Series.
1914.
Mhm. Yeah. So again, if psychics were real in that way, then we would see their effects in other areas, but it's just not the case. Like just knowing someone's PIN number or account information and then just stealing all the, like society wouldn't function the way it does. But you know, the way people do steal that information is like online hacking, right? That's how they figure that stuff out. So I'm trying to say that there's a difference here between these things, right? And then, you know, from society over here, we have like cults, which is also a different thing. And there's certain properties that I went through before that are not the case for this kind of an organization. So once we go through the mindfulness and relaxation response information, then we've kind of learned how to practice meditation in a healthy way. The relaxation response is a little different than mindfulness. But so we're just going to say both of them are useful for this purpose. And then we have other skills that are within this well-being program. And then once we're done that, then we can kind of start going through some things in the history of philosophy that, you know, might be of interest to people. I just reserve that, like just taking a class in university by someone who has a PhD in that field or has done a lot of research. It's not a bad idea. I can go through it, but I like to take those classes with those people because they know a lot. You know what I mean? So I think it's good for you guys to do that as well. I think that the philosophy study as it is, I don't assume to know everything. I'm more working on practical elements of how to implement these things and organizing the group in this way. But yeah, like my expertise is more about what the meaning of the group is and how the group fits together. But we do need to have other people that are experts in their field to teach us those things. Like someone on Plato, for example, you know, that's read a lot about Plato and knows about the history of Greece at the time and these kinds of things, right? I just haven't done that reading. My reading is in these areas. So yeah. Okay, so what do you guys think?
That's a good idea.
It's a good idea. All right. So we're going to go through the 7 habits next. Maybe next week we can do it. If none of the students have the book. What are you talking about, Way next week? You're like, so anyways, what we'll do is, I guess we can wait till the week after. So that's 2 weeks from today to get the books. Did you order it? No.
Reasonable.
Communicate.
Just communicate. All right. So what I will do is I may get them and then I'll let you know. If I get them, then you guys can just pick it up.
You have a PDF version too, if you want, for the people in the
Yeah,
meeting.
sure. Yeah, like that's
Are we
the
allowed to
thing.
do that?
Probably not, but probably not.
I mean, we own the book. Maybe not a digital copy, but
Yeah, publishers want you to pay for it, generally speaking. So this stuff goes into like certain ways of thinking that are going to promote well-being and certain habits and behaviors that will promote well-being. And that's the practical element. And then, yeah, there's specific things that we have to deal with as well. Like social situations that require some kind of response and what can we do in those situations? But yeah, we'll leave that for another day. That's just, this is kind of just an introduction to the 7 habits and what we're going to talk about from there on in.
Okay.
So, I don't know, is that good for today?
Mhm.